Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Mina Bose. I'm the Executive Dean for Public Policy and Public Service Programs at Hofstra and Director of our Peter S. Calico Center for the Study of the American Presidency. And it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you here today for a joint lecture that is being sponsored by the Calico Center, the Calico School, and the Division of Student Affairs to discuss a wonderful, fascinating new study of Colin Powell. My words are going to be very brief here because I'm going to turn the floor over to my distinguished colleague, Vice President of Student Affairs, Houston Doherty, to give the formal introduction of our speaker. Let me just say a few very quick words of welcome. We are delighted to see so many of our students here. We know that you didn't have a class, so you're doing this because of your own interest, which is wonderful. Several colleagues in the Department of Political Science, Dr. Perotti, Dr. Burnett, thank you for joining us today. We are thrilled to have two high school classes here from St. Dominic's and Island Trees. Thank you for making the trip. We're so glad the weather cooperated, so you'll hopefully have a chance to spend some time on campus as well. And special thanks to the entire Division of Student Affairs for all of their work in planning this trip. The Calico student fellow, Emma Rossetti, who is actually doing something right now, so she's missing my thank you, but was indispensable in the preparation for this. And of course, the Hofstra Cultural Center. And I have been reminded that when we go to the Q&A, which will be about halfway through this event, we are broadcasting this so that it will appear on the Hofstra website and you'll have a chance to look back at it. And for that broadcast to work, we do need to have you answer a question from the microphone. So my understanding is, Colin, that they can either line up or there will be a mic brought to you. So please just keep that in mind, and we'll remind you again when the Q&A begins. But for now, I think some of the most fruitful collaborations at a university are when you can bring together the academic side and the student affairs side. And I've had the pleasure over the past year for working closely with my colleague and dear friend, Houston Doherty, Vice President of Student Affairs. I think everyone knows him for the work that he does for students, for faculty, for the university. Please join me in giving him a warm welcome.
Thank you, Mina. Welcome. It's great to see everyone here on this Monday morning. Welcome to this talk that we've been anticipating for several months now. This talk, which is co-sponsored by the Calico School, the Calico Center for the Study of the American Presidency, the Hofstra Cultural Center, and the Division of Student Affairs. As part of our Seeking Purpose series, thanks to Mina, thanks to Colin Sullivan and Athleen Collins in all their work to help us make this happen today. The Seeking Purpose series gives Hofstra students the unique opportunity to hear from and interact with professionals from a wide variety of fields who've created not only a career path for themselves, but also have an inspiring professional journey. The series encourages us as we create our own paths to pride and purpose and motivates us to make the most out of every opportunity and experience. It's a particularly proud day for me to be able to welcome my friend Jeff Matthews from the University of Puget Sound to be part of this series. Jeff is the George F. Jewett Distinguished Professor in the School of Business Leadership at the University of Puget Sound, which is a small liberal arts college in Tacoma, Washington, where I also went to college 40 years ago. So it's terrific to have Jeff here representing Puget Sound. Jeff's the recipient of multiple teaching awards, including the President's Teaching Excellence Award at Puget Sound. He has degrees from Northern Arizona University, University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and a PhD in American History from the University of Kentucky. As a historian and leadership scholar, Matthews has published dozens of articles and 4 books, including Black Sheep Leadership, and most recently, the book we're here to talk about today, Colin Powell, Imperfect Patriot. His book, The Art of Command, Military Leadership from George Washington to Colin Powell, is required reading at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College, and has also been translated into Chinese for officer training in the Taiwanese Department of Defense. He is the former risk manager at Wells Fargo Bank of Nevada. He's a founding partner of Camouflaj, video game studio, headquartered in Bellevue, Washington. And that game studio is currently making the Iron Man VR game for Sony Entertainment and Marvel Comics. And in fact, this afternoon, Jeff has been kind enough to spend the day with us at Hofstra, and at 2:55 this afternoon in the Zarb School Idea Hub, he's going to be getting together with folks to talk about his work helping create Camouflaj. Jeff, it's really terrific to have you here. Jeff has a phenomenal reputation at Puget Sound as an engaging teacher and scholar. He also is just well loved as someone who cares about students and cares about their learning. So please join me in giving Jeff Matthews a big Hofstra welcome. Jeff.
Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Dr. Bose and Vice President Daugherty, for having me here. It's just a wonderful opportunity to go from one coast to the other. Now, being from the Tacoma, Seattle area, we're used to rain, but the rain we had yesterday was way more rain than we typically get on a day. So we spent the afternoon in the Brooklyn Museum, which was a nice escape. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm glad there's many high school students here. General Powell would be glad that there's high school students here. He graduated from high school in the South Bronx, and he spent a lot of his philanthropy work working with high school students and young people across the country. So it's very special that you're here. Now, this will not be a death by PowerPoint presentation. I think there's a total of 5 slides, and they're largely just photographs to keep us on track with our 4 various presidents that we'll talk about. Now, when Colin Powell was a young boy and when he was a teenager, there were no signs of greatness to be seen, to be uncovered. He was the son of working class immigrant parents from Jamaica. He was born in Harlem, grew up in the South Bronx. He was not a good student. He was not a good athlete. He was not a student government leader. He was not even really a leader amongst his friends because his core friend group were older than he was. Now, he graduated from City College of New York, but just barely graduated, and he was a geology major because he heard it was the easiest major on campus, and that's where he wanted to go. Now, 14 years ago, my fundamental research question regarding General Powell was, then given this beginning of his life, how do we explain that he becomes the most important military, political, diplomatic figure of his generation? He finds his purpose in life at City College of New York. It wasn't academia, it was the U.S. Army. It was an ROTC program at City College, and that's where he found his home, and that's where he found his career. He goes on to serve in Vietnam 2 tours of duty in 1963 and 1968. He's wounded on both tours, so a highly decorated combat veteran. At the age of 41, he becomes the youngest general in the United States military. At the age of 49, he becomes the first African-American Deputy National Security Advisor in the Reagan administration. At the age of 50, he becomes the first African-American National Security Advisor to President Reagan. At the age of 52, he becomes the highest-ranking military officer in the United States as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And by the time he retires from the military, he is the singular most popular political military figure in the United States, more popular than any president. Bill Clinton was president at the time he retired, and he was far more popular amongst Democrats and Republicans, and he almost ran for president, and many people believe had he run for president himself, he would have won. He takes basically, though, a 7-year hiatus after he retires before getting back directly into political affairs in a serious way. And this is in 2000, where he agrees to support the presidency of George W. Bush. And when Bush defeats Al Gore, he asks Powell to become his Secretary of State. So at the age of 63, he becomes the first African-American Secretary of State. So certainly we have a very proven and historically important figure in Colin Powell. Now, this trajectory, though, of starting from this very kind of humble beginnings, where he's seen as largely ambitionless and aimless, not sure what he wants to do, and how do we explain then the trajectory for him to become this remarkably powerful and popular person? Well, the conventional wisdom at the time when I started doing my research was, in short, that Powell was a great leader. And that explains his success over and over again, promotion after promotion. And certainly there is clear evidence of Powell's effectiveness as a leader in his military career in different parts, but especially in his early military career. But it didn't take me long to come to the conclusion that a better explanation, a more powerful explanation for understanding this tremendous arc of this person was not his skills as a leader, but they were his skills as a follower. And this gets us into the dimension of leadership studies that is known as followership. And so what makes for a great subordinate? Right? Most leaders in all their capacities are often serving in the role not only as a leader of other people, but a follower of their own boss, of their own superior. And so how does one toggle between I lead some people, but I also work for somebody else? When we think of Colin Powell in a 2 million person military, and he becomes the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest ranking person of all the military, and yet his primary job was to be a subordinate to the President and the Secretary of Defense. His primary job was to provide them advice on military affairs. So even at the top of a 2 million person organization, your followership skills, your skills as a subordinate, are very, very important. And Powell in his career, especially in the latter part of his military career, was a subordinate to very powerful military and civilian leaders who brought his career along. In those few times where Powell gets into trouble in his professional life, it's these very important, powerful mentors who save him from the troubles that he had made along the way. And so this idea for the book, then the larger framework for the book and the conversation is thinking about his performance as a government servant from the perspective of his role as a subordinate to powerful people. And in this particular talk, focusing on 4 presidents that he worked for directly. Now, I would say in terms of qualities, really quickly, that I try to examine this idea of what makes for a good subordinate. We're talking about not only highly competent people, skilled people, people who are developing their competencies along the way. We're also talking about the level of their commitment, their motivation, their dedication to what they're doing. But we're also looking for deep critical thinkers, not just doers, but doers and thinkers, people who can do things, but they can think for themselves, So they demonstrate a degree of independence is very critical. And finally, another lens that I'm looking for is the idea of ethical conduct. And so I'm tracking Powell's career from these multiple lenses to see his own development. Which characteristics does he have from the beginning, and which characteristics does he have to learn along the way? Before I start in with President Reagan, I'd like to tell a true story about my own interactions with General Powell. So if you'll imagine in March of 2017, I'm back home in Washington and my daughters are taking me out for a belated birthday dinner. So I drop them off at the restaurant and I go to the parking lot, park the car, and I'm looking at my phone like we're apt to do, and I look down and I see I have an email, and the email's from Colin Powell, and the subject of the email says Colin Powell. And I'm thinking, okay, which one of my friends has gone to the trouble to create a fake Gmail address and send me an email from Colin Powell? So I sit down with my daughters at dinner and it says, "Dear Professor Matthews, I appreciate an article you've written recently. I'd like to discuss it with you. Is this the right address if I want to communicate with you?" And I show it to my daughters who have heard a lot about Colin Powell as they were growing up. And I said to them, I'll just call his assistant in the morning to see if this is really General Powell, because this is a Sunday night. And my daughters all, "Oh no, Dad, you have to respond right away." So I send a response to this weird Gmail address, "Dear General Powell, I doubt this is really you, but if it is you, this is a good email address to reach me." He sends back an email that essentially says, "Haha, yes, it really is me, and I'll be in contact with you soon." So a few days later, I get a long email from General Powell, and it's in response to an op-ed piece that I wrote for The Hill, which is a Washington, D.C. political newspaper. And at the time, Trump had just recently come to office, and he had picked General H.R. McMaster, a three-star Army general, to be his national security advisor. And I have some association with General McMaster, and so I wrote an op-ed letter that was essentially to General McMaster saying, hey, in this new position you're going to take in the Trump administration, there are some things you can learn about from Colin Powell's experience. And mostly things you can learn that are positive. And so my article had a lot of positive things about General Powell, but I also said there's a couple of things you can learn from General Powell's mistakes, and a couple of things I talked about specifically. And so that was General Powell was responding to. Of course, he wasn't responding to all the positive things I said in my email. He wanted to come after me for the 2 criticisms that I had in the email. And he writes a 500-word attack telling me how amusing I am and how ignorant I am about things. And then at the end, he says, keep writing, though. So I had a choice at that point in terms of how I was going to engage, right, with the former Secretary of State, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and I certainly wasn't going to debate him on the issues via email. So what I did was I worked our email conversations into an interview. And 3 months later, I was at his house. And we spent about 4 hours together talking about all kinds of subjects. By then, I had written a draft of the book, and so I was pretty well prepared in terms of the things I wanted to ask him about. And I'm happy to talk about that interview later. If I start first here with Ronald Reagan. So Colin Powell worked in the Reagan administration from 1983 really to 1987. First, he spent 3 years as a senior military assistant to the Secretary of Defense. So the figure by the American flag there is Caspar Weinberger. Caspar Weinberger, Secretary of Defense, was extremely close, personal friends with the president, and Powell for 3 years worked under Caspar Weinberger. Powell saw Weinberger as basically a father figure for him, where I would say General Powell saw President Reagan more as a grandfatherly type figure. Powell had tremendous respect for both men. I think he saw President Reagan as kind of more of a big picture visionary person whose strength was not in the minutia of policy or decision making. He had a very delegatory style. He would delegate decisions to people like Powell and Secretary of Defense Weinberger. Now, for each of these 4 presidents I want to talk about, I decided to focus maybe on one particular policy for each president, and I'll go fairly quickly to save some time. But the issue I would like to focus on Powell's performance here has to do with something known as the Iran-Contra scandal, the Iran-Contra affair. And for those of you that don't know what that was, during the Reagan administration, the government got involved in some illegal activity. They were selling military arms to Iran, which was a declared terrorist state and was illegal for the president to do this. Because Congress had to be notified. But as a result, there was a big covert program that essentially was allowing Israel to sell American missiles to Iran, and then we would replenish Israel's stockpiles with American-made weapons. Caspar Weinberger, the defense secretary and friend of the president, and then his chief assistant, Colin Powell, they were largely against this program, the selling of missiles, military equipment to Iran. And they believed it to be illegal as it was. Nonetheless, they did not object to the policy strong enough to the president. They did not notify Congress. They did not go to the Department of Justice. And when I think about their followership under the president, in the end, what they had become was complicit in an illegal foreign policy program. And to explain their complicity, you have to understand what they consciously decided to do was to value their loyalty to the president over their loyalty to the Constitution. And this is one of the problems for subordinates who work for leaders that you admire, right? If you admire your boss has been good for you, and your boss is the president of the United States, and you believe in your boss, when they order you to do something, you're very inclined to do it, regardless of its legality. And so while during this time period, we could describe Powell's behavior working as very dedicated, certainly committed to the institution, very able, very skilled and competent, and very effective in his job. That's not the only qualities that we want from the best subordinates, right? We want those qualities in subordinates, but we also want them to adhere to ethical conduct. And to make matters worse, in this Iran-Contra scandal was not just the illegal activity itself, of course, but when it becomes known to the press, to the public, then the cover-ups begin. Right? And it's an opportunity for people to confess that they've made mistakes, they've committed crimes, but the other option they have, of course, is to lie about the crimes and to cover up their crimes. And so we had a case where you have the Secretary of Defense very loyal to his friend the president. He's going to do everything he can to protect the president for any kind of legal proceedings. And then you have Colin Powell, who's not only loyal to the president, extremely dedicated to his boss, the Secretary of Defense, and he doesn't want to get his boss into trouble either. And so they both began to obstruct justice in the many congressional and federal investigations, and they lie to federal investigators about what they knew and what they supported. And Reagan decides he doesn't issue any pardons, but Reagan's successor, George Bush, who was his vice president, he does issue pardons. And so Powell's boss was indicted on 5 felony counts and was about to go to trial. And President Bush, at the time the successor to Reagan, pardons Weinberger and other people associated with Iran-Contra who were involved both in the original crimes but also in the cover-up. And when the trial never happens, Colin Powell never gets called as a witness. And so in many ways, he dodged a serious bullet by having to make a decision at the end of the day. Was he going to continue with the cover-up, or would he tell the truth at trial? So I think in terms, at this point, when I'm thinking about Powell's development, right, as a subordinate, that in many ways he has the competencies, the skills, the dedication to get the work done, but he hasn't yet fully developed his ethical sense of what is right or wrong and what kind of conduct is acceptable, even at this high level of government. So, as I alluded to, George H.W. Bush here was Reagan's vice president, and he wins the presidency in 1988 after Reagan's second term. And he promotes General Powell from a 3-star general to a 4-star general, and he makes Powell the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, so this highest ranking military figure. And Powell's relationship with George H.W. Bush is extremely good. By the time they start working as they're working together in the White House, the Bushes see Powell as part of their own family, part of the Bush family. That's how close they became. And they work exceptionally well together. And I argue in the book, as a specific example in terms of the Persian Gulf War, to focus on that for a few minutes, that Powell's service to the president, right, as a follower of the president, as a subordinate, it's at this time where I argue Powell is the consummate subordinate. There was nobody better qualified to be in that job and to serve the president, especially during the Persian Gulf War, than Colin Powell. And I'll just give a few examples here related to the war. And again, we're thinking about what are the ideal qualities that we want in a subordinate. And so in the Persian Gulf War, for those of you who don't remember or don't know, Iraq under Saddam Hussein invades a small country, Kuwait. And so when this invasion happens, the question for the United States is, what should the United States do about this invasion in the Middle East? Well, certainly everyone decides very quickly that we need to protect Saudi Arabia, right? A close ally of ours. We need to protect the oil fields of Saudi Arabia, that Iraq doesn't expand their invasion from Kuwait, right, into Saudi Arabia. And so the United States proceeds to put 250,000 troops into Saudi Arabia to protect Saudi Arabia from an Iraq attack. Now, the difficult question, though, was, should the United States do anything to end Iraq's occupation of Kuwait? Right? Should we go to war with Iraq to get them to leave Kuwait? That was more debatable. And here's an example of where Powell, in my estimation, also does extremely well job, because he is the most resistant to go to war. Within the Bush administration, most people are more hawkish. We have to go to war. We have to get Iraq out of Kuwait. We can't let this stand, the president says. But Powell, as a combat veteran and a believer that you don't go to war, okay, unless it's directly in the national security interest and there's no other options than war, Powell is saying to the president, we should wait. We should use diplomatic and economic sanctions, pressure them, give them time. What he calls, we should just surround them, contain them, right, and ratchet up the pressure before we send troops on the ground. And so for me, this is a good example of what you want in a subordinate. who draws on their expertise, who knows their position is different than their superior, and has the courage to tell the superior, I think this would be a mistake. And that's what we would want. But when the president says, I've made up my mind, General Powell, and we're going to go to war, then of course General Powell salutes, right? And as a subordinate should, right? That this is the boss, he's not doing anything illegal, right? It's his foreign policy, not my foreign policy. So I think there's a lot to admire here. Now, a second step, I'll give 3 examples here of what I admire about Powell is, after the president decided to go to war, his preference was mostly to use the Air Force, okay, to use air power against Iraq to get them out of Kuwait. And again, General Powell goes to the president and says, Mr. President, if the objective is to get Iraq out of Kuwait, I don't think air power is sufficient. We need to put soldiers on the ground in order for me to guarantee the execution of the policy that you want, right? The objective you want is to get the Iraqis out. And the president says, well, how many soldiers do you need, right, to guarantee victory? And Powell says, I need another 250,000 men. So we need 500,000, right, soldiers on the ground in Saudi Arabia for an invasion of Iraq. And when Powell gives this huge number, right, jaws kind of drop in the White House because we haven't seen any commitment like that, right, in recent memory. And the president says to Powell, you're right, we'll do it your way. And he gets the 250,000 soldiers. And again, I think this is a good example of a subordinate, right, who disagrees with their boss and has the courage to tell their boss, right, their counter view, and in this case, convince his boss, right, to make this big change. And the last thing I will say about why I really am impressed with Powell during this time period is, by the time, as the war was drawing down, after only 3 days of troops fighting on the ground after a massive aerial assault over weeks, it was General Powell who said, when should we end this war? And so what was happening once the United States got involved with its international allies, it did not take long to defeat the Iraqi troops and to convince them that they should get out of Kuwait. One of the problems for Powell towards the end of the war, though, there was one main highway coming out of Kuwait, going to the city of Basra. And as the Iraqi soldiers were trying to escape out of Kuwait, the Allied programs, the Allied troops, especially Americans, they were just bombing the heck out of all these Iraqi troops trying to get out of Kuwait. And for Powell, he went to the president and he said, I think by the killing of these people only because we can kill them is ethically wrong. Our objective here was to get the Iraqi troops out of Kuwait. And he said, sir, we're achieving that objective. And the idea that we would kill for killing's sake would lose the moral high ground for the United States. And we never want to lose the moral high ground. And the president says, in effect, have you talked to the general in the field? This was General Schwarzkopf, and he says, I have. And he agrees that we can end the war within a day, and we'll have achieved our objectives. And the president said, okay, let's end the war tomorrow. And he does. And I think, so this is really, again, another really important, I think, lesson to be taken from, right, a subordinate who reports to a very important person is you're there to give your advice, to be independent, to demonstrate your critical thinking, and to offer it, right, to have the moral courage to offer it even though your superior might object. And so I think in this case, I really do see Powell as operating at the supreme ideal level that we would want someone in that position. Now, moving on, George H.W. Bush does not win re-election. He loses when he runs for election again to Bill Clinton. And so when Bill Clinton comes to office, he kind of inherits General Powell as his top military officer, right, as this chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And the president decides he wants to keep Powell in that job. He has a great respect for Colin Powell. And while we can say that Colin Powell viewed Ronald Reagan as a kind of a grandfather figure that he admired, and George H.W. Bush as kind of a father figure that he admired and worked really well with, General Powell is 10 years older than Bill Clinton, and so it was not like an elder statesman that he was working for. As a matter of fact, Powell was thinking, given his extensive experience, and Bill Clinton as president did not have extensive foreign policy or military experience, that he could really help this president in a new way. And in short, the relationship actually, Powell had largely worked for Republican presidents, so this would be the first Democrat president that he worked with. And while they didn't agree on issues all the time, they got to know each other very well. They worked extremely well together out of mutual respect and admiration, and became surprisingly quite close. Now, I'd like to give just one example of policy here between General Powell and Bill Clinton, and this is the idea the United States had a ban on homosexuals serving in the military. And President Clinton, when he was running as a candidate, he had put in his platform that he would end the ban on homosexuals serving in the military. And General Powell was known to be against ending the ban. And so when they first started working together, General Powell was advising the new president, please don't take on this issue as your first issue because it's so controversial. Most people in the military did not want the ban to end. Most people in Congress did not want the ban to end. And so this became, internally then a very heated topic in terms of what to do. And I'm shorthanding some things here, but I would just say what I admire about Powell is not that he was necessarily right on the issue, but he believed he was right on the issue, and he made the case for why the president shouldn't end the ban. But more importantly, he didn't leave it as a black and white issue. He also came to the president and said, I have an alternative solution. And perhaps we don't have to technically end the ban, but we can stop some practices. For example, that when we hire new recruits, we historically had asked them, are you a homosexual, right? And if they admitted to it, then they would not be allowed to enlist. And after they joined the service, whether it's the Navy, the Army, or Marines, if it was thought that they might be homosexual, then government investigated them to try to kick them out of the military. And Powell told the president, what I think can pass Congress, and that can be an honorable compromise for now, would be a policy that became known as don't ask, don't tell. So let's have our recruiters stop asking this question, and let's just admit people if they're qualified to be admitted. And then once people are in the service, if they keep their private lives private, then there's no reason the government should investigate people in their personal lives. Of course, this was not satisfactory to a lot of people, and the president himself was very hesitant. But the president realized that in terms of what the art of possible politics, what could be passed in Congress, that this compromise that Powell had a lot to do with ended up being U.S. policy, and the Congress did support it. And so I think, it's not so much that Powell's always right on the issues, but it's the way he acted as a subordinate. Because what was really crucial in these conversations between the general and the president was Powell routinely said to the president and to the press, if everyone knows I'm against the ending of the ban, but if the president orders a ban, General Powell said, I will execute the ban to exactly what he wants to do. In other words, he might disagree with the policy, but he knows that with just authority, you obey just authority. This would be a legal order by the president's commander-in-chief, and that Powell would execute an order even if he disagreed with it, as long as it was legal. And this certainly would have been legal. Finally, we'll move to George W. Bush, President H.W. Bush's son, who becomes president in 2000. Now, if I argue in the book that by the time Powell became the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he's in many ways, I argue, the consummate subordinate, the exact kind of person you would want working for you, in terms of his dedication, his skill set, his ethical conduct. The question then becomes 7 years after he retired, when he becomes Secretary of State, not a military position, a civilian position. How are we to evaluate his role as serving that president, as a subordinate to the president here? Because certainly here, his job, again, most followers, most senior leaders even work for someone more senior than them, and his primary task here is to present to the president, his advice on foreign policy, foreign policy issues. Now, and people have asked me, well, how do I assess Powell as Secretary of State? Was he a great Secretary of State? And I've come to the conclusion that the record is mixed. Okay, there are things to admire, and there are things that one should not think fondly of in Powell's 4 years as Secretary of State. Now, President Bush, like President Clinton, was 10 years younger than Powell. And like President Clinton, President Bush did not have much foreign policy or national security or military experience. And so Powell saw himself by this time as an elder statesman, right, who had this impressive national security experience that he could lend a lot to the Bush administration and for this president who was inexperienced in this realm. I'll mention a few things that I think Powell deserves a lot of credit for as Secretary of State, and then I'll mention a few things I think where he deserves just criticism. One area would be when one becomes Secretary of State, you literally become the leader of the State Department. 40,000 people worldwide, right? A massive organization. And in this area, Powell proves to be a transformational leader. Highly successful leader of the State Department. The State Department he inherits is woefully inadequate. Facilities across the world are dilapidated. Technology is 25 years behind that the State Department is using. The State Department is way understaffed in terms of the number of personnel, and their training for personnel is woefully lacking. Powell comes in, again, extremely popular person, both with Democrats and Republicans. He's able to go to Congress for the president and argue for massive new funding for the State Department to improve security, improve facilities, improve staffing around the world. And so you can imagine the people in the State Department are very happy that Colin Powell has come to town. As a matter of fact, one Assistant Secretary of State said when Colin Powell came to the State Department, it was like George Washington crossing the Delaware. Right? People were just cheering because of what he was able to deliver. So highly effective in that leadership capacity for the president in terms of transforming the State Department. A second area that I think Powell deserves a lot of credit for has to do with the direct, immediate aftermath of 9/11. When the terrorists attacked 9/11, Powell was actually in Peru, okay, at a conference, and so it took him 8 hours to get back to the United States after the bombings had happened. And when he got back to the United States, he rushed to the White House, where there was one of the first kind of meetings of the president and his cabinet, his key staff, to talk about it. And at the time of that very first meeting, the Vice President, Dick Cheney, the Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, his assistant, Paul Wolfowitz, they were already arguing that the United States' response should be to bomb Iraq. And Colin Powell said, why in the world would we bomb Iraq? There's no evidence that Iraq had anything to do with 9/11. As a matter of fact, all the immediate evidence suggests, right, that this was Al-Qaeda, a terrorist group out of Afghanistan. And for the next week, Powell found himself in meeting after meeting trying to fend off the Vice President and the Secretary of Defense for wanting to attack Iraq. Powell, the President, and Powell dealing with the President directly, Powell sensed that the President believed that Saddam Hussein and Iraq had something to do with the attacks, but we hadn't found the evidence yet. And Powell told the President, when we have evidence of Iraq's involvement, then that would be worthy of a retaliatory attack. But Mr. President, he said, the people who did this, and the CIA of course confirms it pretty quickly, is the terrorists, right, Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. And so Powell advocates the war of Afghanistan, and of course that war commences pretty quickly. So I give Powell a lot of credit because the president himself, thinking that Saddam Hussein had something to do with this, was not reactive and did not immediately do what Cheney and Rumsfeld had wanted. And I think it's partly because Powell gave him an option not to have done that. And the third thing, positive thing I'll just say about Powell, Secretary of State, has to do with world health. I think one area that most people have forgotten about the Bush administration in its first term was funding for world health programs. So what happened was the beginning of the Bush administration, Kofi Annan, who was the Secretary of the United Nations, he wanted to start a new global fund to help combat the spread of HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria, primarily in Africa and to some degree in Central America. And he wanted the United States to contribute the first $200 million to this global health fund. Well, the president did not want to do it. The president did not think highly of the United Nations, but Powell was quick to realize that world health has a lot to do with instability across the globe, right? And then which means it has to do with national security. And so Powell, with the help of another cabinet colleague, Tommy Thompson, they go to the president and say, Mr. President, we think you should give this money because it does have national security implications in the long run. The president reluctantly agrees to supply $200 million to the fund. And the more he learns about the program and its effectiveness, he becomes more genuine, enthusiastic, and excited about the program and increases U.S. aid to $500 million for the program. And when that program starts to breed more success, the president is more and more excited about it. He creates a separate American global health program that he funds at the tune of $15 billion. And this is another good example, I think, of a subordinate, right, taking to a president, right, they're independent thinking about it, and is able to convince the president to do the right thing. 3 quick things on criticisms of Powell. Powell himself admits one of his biggest mistakes that he ever made was in February of 2003, where he goes to the United Nations and he makes the case for war against Iraq. So 9/11 happens in 2001, and it's just in 2003 where Powell goes to the United Nations. So there's been a huge transformation with Powell in terms of being willing to make the case to go to war with Iraq after all. And this is the famous speech where Powell says to the world, right, on international television, does Iraq have chemical weapons? Right? Powell says absolutely in his speech. Does Iraq have biological weapons? Powell says absolutely in his speech. Powell, the question is Iraq on the verge of a nuclear program, right? A nuclear threat. Are they on the verge of one? Powell says absolutely they're on the verge of one. Powell's asked, is there a connection between Iraq and terrorists like Al-Qaeda? Powell says absolutely there is one. Right? This is the speech, the selling of the war. Well, what we know now is all of that was not true. So Powell admits in a second book that he wrote in 2012 that this is the biggest failure, right, of my career, was having given that speech. And we could talk about the origins of that speech and why that happened, because there's a question of what was the failure here? Was Powell lying to the American people, lying to the world about these weapons of mass destruction and connections to terrorists? I didn't know, right? I had that same question going into the project. And I've come to the conclusion, thinking about, right, Powell as a subordinate, right, how is he helping the president, is this was not an ethical lapse. Okay, that Powell wasn't purposely lying. I believe he believed what he said. I think the problem was not of ethics, but intelligence. There was a lack of critical thinking going on here. And I can tell you, Powell to this day says the primary basis of his speech was a document, a classified document, on Iraq called the National Intelligence Estimate on Iraq, about what's the threat of Iraq, that was the basis of the speech. Well, not too long ago, that document, 97 pages, became public. And so you could read what the intelligence community was saying to the president, was saying to Powell about the threat. And the actual intelligence is not categorical like Powell's speech. The actual intelligence has a lot of ambiguity. The intelligence says, well, we're actually not really sure how much chemical weapons he has. We're not really sure how much biological weapons we have. Powell's own intelligence unit in the State Department said, we don't believe there's any kind of nuclear program. And as far as a connection to the terrorists, the intelligence community said the only way Saddam Hussein would associate himself, right, in a military fashion with terrorists would be if he thought the United States was on the verge of overthrowing his government. So the question was not just, was there a threat in Iraq? Was there an immediate threat, right? Was the threat imminent? Were they about to attack us? Right? That was the justification for war. And the intelligence report clearly makes sense that there was no imminent threat. They believed there was a threat, but the threat hadn't changed from the previous year or the previous year or the previous year. And Powell, I argue, suffered from what's known as confirmation bias. This is the idea, if you believe something to be true, right? I believe this is true. I know this is true. Well, if you believe something so fervently, when you're looking at evidence, you only take the evidence that confirms what you already know to be true. And the evidence that contradicts what you know to be true, you throw out because you already know what the truth is, right? So that other stuff is garbage. The other stuff is bad intelligence. And I think that's what Powell allowed himself to do. He didn't stop to think clearly about it. I remember I sent General Powell an email, and I said, General Powell, I've reread the National Intelligence Report on the Iraq threat. Did you read this intelligence report? And his response back was essentially, I was in so many intelligence briefings and I read so many things, I can't say for certain what I did and what I did not read. And then he said, but I certainly read it after we found there were no weapons of mass destruction. Well, that's too late. So in closing, I would just say, in working on this project, a couple themes that I've really thought deeply about is the question of loyalty. And I often tell my students, the highest form of loyalty sometimes means being disloyal. Meaning, you're not loyal to your boss, but you're loyal to either your core moral principles, right? This is something that I won't stand for, even if my boss wants to do something, or a higher moral principle. And if you work for the US government, that higher moral principle is the Constitution and the American people, regardless of who your boss is, regardless of how much you might admire your boss. Sometimes, right, you have to challenge, right? And sometimes, right, you have to challenge so much, maybe you have to quit, and maybe you have to go public with what you know. And the second moral thing I would say in terms of thinking about the book is this idea that we're all imperfect. We're all fallible. I remember going to see General Powell in his house, and I started the interview with kind of giving him some context for the book. And I said, General Powell, I'm kind of arguing that even our greatest presidents, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt, our greatest presidents were all flawed people who made big mistakes in their personal life, and they made big mistakes in their professional life in terms of policies. And as I'm saying this context, right, to Powell, General Powell gets this wide grin, and he just starts pointing at himself, right? I'm fallible, just like those great presidents. And that's when I knew, right, that was the beginning of my confirmation of what I am arguing in this book is correct. Right? It's not the idea that someone's perfect, but I think the true test of one's character is, what do you do after you make a mistake? Do you admit your mistake? Right? Do you make amends for your mistake? Do you learn from your mistake? That really will tell you who you are and help you in your development, whether it's as a leader or as a follower. And so if we go back to where I started with this newspaper article that I wrote in 2017, one of my criticisms of General Powell in that piece that he didn't like, that I said, you needed to have a better relationship with the president. So again, I was writing this piece towards General McMaster, who was just going to work for President Trump. And essentially I was saying what Powell did not have with President Bush was a close personal relationship. They rarely met together one-on-one to talk about issues. And so I was telling General McMaster, for you to be effective, you need to have the best relationship you can with the president in order to lever more influence from down below. Well, in his original email response, General Powell did not take kindly to that. He has said, you don't know what my relationship with the president was. Well, of course, I had a good idea based on years of research. Well, if you fast forward to the to the interview, he's walking me towards the door as we're walking out, and it was a very pleasant interview, and he leans over to me and he whispers in my ear and he says, you were right about the president, right, in his relationship with him. And I closed with, I said, General Powell, there's going to be things in this book that you are not going to like. And to his credit, he said to me, write what you think is right, and that's what I've done. Thank you for coming today.
Thank Thank you. I was waiting for the mic. Thank you, Professor Matthews. This was a really interesting evolution of Colin Powell's leadership. And so I enjoyed reading your book and then hearing you describe those 4 case studies, senior military leadership to political leadership, raises a number of questions that I'd like to, I hope we'll have a chance to discuss. There's one in particular that I've been thinking about for some time, since Colin Powell published his memoir in the mid-1990s, I think it was. And I know that your book has carefully looked at that memoir, his later work, other biographies, and really distilled that research to date in this very incisive analysis of where General Powell, Secretary Powell, excelled as a leader and what his shortcomings were. It seems to me that as Colin Powell moves into senior positions, in particular JCS chairman and Secretary of State, that in both of those cases, he's in a position of leadership, and yet there's always someone to whom he still has to report. And I'm thinking about in the 1990, the lead up to the Persian Gulf War. He writes about this in his memoir, and I think you reference it here. He's in a meeting with President Bush 41 and talks about the number of troops. And afterward, the Secretary of Defense, Dick Cheney, pulls him aside and says that he had stepped out of his lane, right? That he was giving political advice and that he's supposed to report through the Secretary of Defense. And he recognized, he's very diplomatic in his memoir and says that he had kind of gone too far. And so then you flash forward again another 11 years and he's Secretary of State, which is kind of the top diplomatic post, but yet he's facing conflicts with the Vice President, Dick Cheney, Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, and your book outlines several examples. I think there's one with the Kyoto climate change, even before Iraq, where the Vice President takes something to Capitol Hill before Powell's had a chance to do more than give a cursory review at best. And I guess so, long history to say, are these examples of Powell's kind of staying too close to followership versus leadership? Are these limitations of his leadership? Does he have the kind of bad fortune to be in working with people who are overstepping their bounds? How do you interpret those examples and what they tell us about Powell's leadership?
Yeah, I would certainly one big difference between when we think about General Powell working for George H.W. Bush in the Gulf War, that era, and then going to work for his son as Secretary of State. One of the big things that's different is the people that Powell is working with within the administration. And so the cabinet, the people that were working in Papa Bush's White House, they worked as an extremely good cohesive team, and they had great similarities in outlook in terms of policy and how problems in the world affairs should be solved. What you have in the George W. Bush administration is not that. It's not a great cohesive team. And certain elements of that, so you have in Dick Cheney, someone who puts himself into policy like no other vice president has. So he assumes a lot of responsibility that no president has, and the president defers that responsibility. And you also have Don Rumsfeld, a lifetime friend of the president, right, who's a very powerful, strong opinionated Secretary of Defense, who doesn't also, like Cheney, necessarily see the world like General Powell does. And you have in Condoleezza Rice, the National Security Advisor, who is not a strong, powerful person up against people like Colin Powell, Dick Cheney, and Don Rumsfeld, right? She's relatively inexperienced. And so the dynamics of which Powell's working on are very, very different. And I would argue that one of Powell's mistakes was he was too confident in his ability to sway the president on issues and was not as aware of how powerful Dick Cheney in particular would be in terms of swaying the president. And the truth is the president, his own view of the world was much more consistent with Cheney's and Rumsfeld and less consistent with Powell. Powell's approach was more of a multilateralist, not a unilateralist in terms of solving world problems. And so I think that dynamic, the change of the situation, the environment, accounts more for the change of the results in policy than a change in Powell himself. if that makes sense, So.
So, going back to Iran-Contra, when Colin Powell is actually in real trouble, how do you think that really affect? I mean, speaking from personal experience, you find yourself in times like, I'm in real trouble. Like, you got to run across those imperfections in your own life where you're like, wow, I really, this is deep.
Yeah.
When I know he's looking before the pardon of his boss, he's actually looking being called as a witness, realizing that if that proceeds, he's really in a position where he's looking at being prosecuted. How do you think that? I mean, that has to reach deep into his psyche and stamp him for a long time moving forward, as to never want to be in that chair ever again.
Correct. And so it won't surprise you to know that Powell was one of the people arguing for Weinberger's pardon to President Bush, H.W. Bush. You should pardon him, you should pardon him, you should pardon him. And his reasonings for that largely came out of his loyalty to his boss, and he greatly admired Weinberger, but certainly would have the added benefit of him not being called as a witness, of which he would have to decide publicly whether he would want to continue obstructing justice, essentially lying about what him and Weinberger did. And so he did avoid that. And to this day, Powell sees himself as a victim of the Iran-Contra investigations, as well as he sees Weinberger as a victim of it, which I think is just ridiculous to do. It's interesting, Robert Gates was defense secretary under Obama, but he was also the deputy CIA director at the time of Iran-Contra. And Bob Gates has a new book out, a leadership book, of which he admits in the book, I didn't do everything I should have. About Iran-Contra. I should have gone to the Justice Department, right? I should have gone to Congress to tell them what was going on. And he said, and I didn't. Powell, to this day, is defiant that he and Weinberger did nothing wrong. But the pardon did save the day. If you read the independent counsel's account of Powell, they essentially said, look, we believe he's been lying, but we've got bigger targets than a two-star general, which he was at the time.
And then, of course, he got voted.
Oh, absolutely. He was a beneficiary of Iran's scandal. It's absolutely right. Becomes national security advisor. Yeah, it's crazy how history works. Powell has this line: "If it wasn't for Iran-Contra, I'd be an obscure retired general somewhere that no one had ever heard of." And that's true.
A comment and a question. The comment is, your last response reminds us that in order to have good followers, you actually have to have good leaders, leaders that are thoughtful and experienced, because it seems to me that he runs into trouble when he is a subordinate to leaders who are inexperienced and themselves, not exercising good judgment. But the question is about race. In your interview with him, and maybe even in your background research, did race and also his background, a subordinate socioeconomic status to these, certainly to the Bushes,
Yep.
Not Clinton, did they play either way to make him more of a critical thinker, looking at things from different perspective, or more deferent on the other hand?
Yeah, so certainly, Powell's own upbringing was to be deferential, to show respect to your elders, right, in terms of just his natural state of being. And so being in the service itself, which is based on the culture of obedience to one's superiors, for him it was a fit that he was very comfortable with. And I think you're right that in terms of when he becomes more associated with very powerful people who actually aid his career in substantial ways, he becomes even more loyal. And deferential to them, and that this idea of developing one's independent critical thinking, that's one area it takes Powell a long time to track to get there. And I argue it's really not until he becomes chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff that there's good, solid evidence of him doing that, essentially of disagreeing with his boss, having different thinking about his boss, and being willing to advocate for that different thinking. And in terms of the kind of the racial component of it there, it's a very interesting story of Powell that Powell has, because, for example, he wasn't raised in the South by comparison, and he makes this comparison a lot. Then he describes his working class neighborhood in the South Bronx as growing up as being a very diverse, ethnically diverse, racially diverse community, of which he never really felt discrimination and bias. It's not until he enters the military that he really starts to confront some bias, often not in the military itself, but often outside in civilian bases, outside the bases where he's having to shop and take his family to, that he really confronts racism in that way. And there's no doubt that Powell, being an African American, was a role in explaining his trajectory. And certainly the Republicans were very happy to have an African American essentially within their administrations, because there just weren't a lot of them. And Powell was someone politically, he would always say, I don't want to be known as a great Army officer, a great black Army officer. I want to be known as a great Army officer who happens to be black. And that was kind of always his outlook about thinking. And he admits that he was a beneficiary of affirmative action, but he never wanted to be seen as the black chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in that way, if that makes sense.
Just a quick question. What was the name of the article that you got published in 2017, and what media outlet was it published on?
It's the Hill newspaper. So if you were to search my name in the Hill newspaper and Colin Powell, it would come up, because they get the name, the titles of the article, so I can't remember exactly, but my guess would be General McMaster's name would be in that piece.
How important was Powell in setting up the coalition under George H. Bush? Because after all, that's what he's known for, getting all these countries together to stop a war when Kuwait was involved.
Yeah, so for the Persian Gulf War, the first Iraq War, so Powell did play a role, especially in terms of the coordination with General Schwarzkopf in terms of the military aspect. How do we get all these countries to be fighting seamlessly? But it's really Jim Baker, who is George H.W. Bush's Secretary of State, James Baker. He deserves the lion's share of the credit for organizing the alliance. As a matter of fact, that was Powell's model for the second war in Iraq, that he wanted to emulate what James Baker did in terms of bring such a diverse alliance. Of course, he was nowhere near as successful, because most countries did not think, there should have been a war against Iraq the second time. So you largely are dependent on the British for a large amount of our allies and the Aussies. But certainly James Baker was Powell's model in many ways.
Thank you for a wonderful lecture. I have one question. So much of what you say today about General Powell and his environment resonates with what's going on. So my question is simply this. How much do you find yourself screaming at the television set as you're watching what's going on?
I have to say, what I think about so frequently is that the policy under George W. Bush and Secretary Powell for the invasion of Iraq, that we're living with the consequences of the decisions they made. Historians generally don't think about counterfactual histories, but the one thing I do with my students is I truly believe that had Al Gore become president and George W. Bush not become president, this was the whole Chad election where the Supreme Court enters who's going to be president. I firmly believe that Al Gore would have had the war in Afghanistan. I do not believe that he would have invaded Iraq. And if that's true, then what we're dealing with in Syria today, what happened in Iraq and the rise of ISIS, that would not have happened, certainly the way that it did. And so that was what really frustrates me, is this was the decision to invade Iraq was such a wrong-headed decision. And in terms of Powell, I just wish he would have been more influential and effective in stemming off that war. Because in terms of criticism of Powell beyond his speech to the UN as Secretary of State, one thing that was extremely disheartening to me was that Powell inside the administration was not fighting for Geneva protections for prisoners of war. All right, as a retired four-star general combat veteran, we all know the military believes so strongly in the Geneva Conventions because it's designed to help our own soldiers and sailors when they're captured and not to be tortured, whether psychological or physical. And that Powell for so long lied to the American people that he didn't know anything about the government's state-sponsored torture program, right, operated through the CIA, but through declassified information, we found out that Powell absolutely participated in meetings and never objected to the torture program, nonetheless not giving POW protections to the prisoners of war. So those are the kinds of things that frustrate me more. I mean, that I think a lot of what we're going through today was born out of the legacy of these kinds of policies. I remember when President Trump was elected, and he said he was in favor of going back to the torture program. That's the kind of thing that really frustrated me. When I was just hearing things like that. That talk about losing the moral high ground, right? That was the worst thing we could engage in, and so I certainly hope we're not doing that now. Anyways.
As far as you're concerned, did H.R. McMaster take your advice?
It's too early to tell, honestly. Certainly one thing I learned on working at this book is a lot of these big questions, historians can't have the answers to them for a long time because government records don't get declassified for years and years later. So it's hard to know the full truth of what's happening. You often get spin from what people what they've done or what they've said. Now, in General McMaster's case, he has a book coming out next year, and so I'm hoping that it will give us much more insight. We're very fortunate at the University of Puget Sound, where I'm at. General McMaster's coming next year to give a talk, and so I'm hoping to learn much more about that. I mean, he was fiercely known as an independent critical thinker throughout his military career, so much often to the detriment of his career, and so one would like to hope that. And I'm not even sure the exact circumstances of his firing, of his dismissal, so I'm not sure what happened. So hopefully we'll learn more.
Any questions from students? And it can be anything about, oh, right over there, please.
During your interview with General Powell, did he ever explain to you why he never ran for the presidency?
Good question. We didn't talk about that specifically, but I've done a lot of research on that, and I've heard him talk about it in other interviews. And the answer is complicated. There's a lot of factors. Some are more important than others. For example, his wife, wasn't very excited about the prospect of it because it was genuine fear that an African American president could be assassinated. Right, and he had given 35 years of his life to his country, and his wife also thought, you've done enough for your country. But I really think two major variables that were more influential is the General Powell doesn't kind of have the internal motivation that it takes to be in politics, in terms of he didn't want to be political himself. He wanted to be in government service, but not a politician, and kind of all the glad handing you have to do, the fundraising and all the debates. That's not really his persona. His personality was more about getting things done than entering the kind of the political space. And another thing that happened when it got closer, because he planned to run, he actually decided, I think I'm going to do this. And as it became increasingly probable that he would run and probably win and he decided he was going to run as a Republican, okay? And when other Republicans realized that he was going to run, the right wing of the Republican Party went out to attack Powell because they didn't see him, and he wasn't a right-wing conservative. He was much more of a moderate person, and the right wing did not want him to get the nomination because he was too moderate for them. And another thing about General Powell is he doesn't like to be criticized in public. And when they came after him in a very public way in newspapers and the media to attack him, it wasn't good for him. He during this time period, he writes that he lost like 10, 20 pounds out of stress of, what should I do? What should I do? And at the end of the day, he just decided, I'm not made to be a politician in terms of his heart of hearts. And so I think that combination of the criticism and what it takes to be a politician just was not who he is as a person. So he's much more comfortable coming back into politics as Secretary of State, right? Because you don't have to run for Secretary of State. You can be appointed. So good question.
What do you think he was most proud of in terms of what period in his life or what event that he was most proud of?
I would say generally it would be just being in the military, serving the country through the military.
Not a specific element or specific decision he made?
I don't know. I don't know if there would be one specific example that he would point to, but certainly the Persian Gulf War he sees as a highlight, a high point of his career and of any administration in terms of this is the way you go to war. In other words, it's a national security issue the president decides, it's a vital interest, that we're going to fight this to win this, and that there's an exit strategy to get out if we achieve the objective, and it's all clear. And so he sees that as a model. But I also think he's very proud of his work in terms of disarmament programs. So the coming of the end of the Cold War and the Reagan administration and Bush administration, the first Bush administration, the nuclear agreements to lessen the nuclear threat. I would say those are probably two things that I would guess he would point to.
What would you say is what was the most challenging part of writing this biography, this book?
Certainly, I think it's the waiting for declassified documents, not knowing what you don't know, in that sense, and also writing a book about someone who's still alive. It's a very challenging thing to do, and also because when you're writing at the time where not only someone's still alive, there's all kinds of new books, new sources that are coming out all the time, like daily. I mean, the postman would bring new books to my day. I mean, every day I'd get a couple, 3 books, and this is going on for years, because you're having to read everything you can, to be on top of what the current scholarship research or primary documents said. And I remember when I got that blistering email from General Powell, I remember driving to work the next morning, and I called a friend of mine who's a historian at Fort Leavenworth, and he wrote a biography of U.S. Grant, General Grant from the Civil War. And so I was driving in a car. I said, Harry, did General Grant ever send you an email, complaining about your biography of him? And so that was pretty interesting. On the flip side is I got a chance to go see him and ask him questions myself directly. I'm often asked the question, what surprised me most about the interview with him that I did? And I have to say what I was most surprised about, his answers to my questions confirmed what I was already arguing. That's what surprised me, is I didn't learn something really big that was new that I didn't know, or something that he challenged me on that I had to rethink. That didn't happen, including our conversation about the torture program. He didn't go into defensive mode and tried to deny things. And so that was the benefit of dealing with someone who's still alive. But it's tricky. For historians, we typically don't do that.
I think I'm going to ask the last question, which actually builds upon this one. Jeff, would you tell us a little bit more about that 4-hour interview with General Powell? I mean, it's really kind of fascinating to think of the opportunity, as well as probably the stress, right, of kind of going back and forth with these issues where you may not find common ground. And I guess in kind of closing then, are there any lessons you would give for students, for scholars who are looking at political biography? Because as we look at the importance of the individual in politics. How can we demonstrate that?
Yeah, I'll take the second part first in terms of advice for students or people interested in writing political biography. It's a genre that I really like, and one of the reasons I really like it is because a lot of people like to read it. And so as a historian, I'm trying to reach as many people as I can, and so political biography gives you the opportunity to do that. Now, in terms of subject selection, my biggest piece of advice is pick someone that you're really passionately interested in. Not that you admire them so much, but just your interest level is so high, because you have to go in with an unbelievable amount of motivation, because it's a long slog. This book took 14 years working on it off and on, and it's a good thing I really admire General Powell because and the things that he was involved with, because it sustains you through the research. But I also say in terms of political biography and biographies in general, is to think about a way not to tell just one story, one narrative. He was born here, he did this. Have another lens to it. For me, the lens was thinking about leadership, but more specifically about this concept of followership, what makes for a great subordinate, and how important that can be to the outcomes of decision making, nonetheless history. And then as far as the Powell interview, I'll just say quickly here, it certainly was a career highlight. To meet General Powell. If you see him on television, if you go on YouTube and see some of his interviews, he comes across as extremely smart, calm, reasonable, funny, and he is that way in person. That's how he greeted me. I had an Uber driver drop me off at his driveway. It was not a gated community. He met me at the door. Dr. Matthews, good to see you. General Powell, good to see you. We sat down in his living room, in a sitting room that he had, and he was this amazingly affable person. Now, I didn't think he thought I was going to be there that long, but I think once we got talking, and I come from a military family, and he knew that, that helped kind of break some of the ice. And he could see that my style of interviewing wasn't to be as an interrogator, but was really there to learn as much as I could, to find out things that I got wrong. And once he recognized the level of detailed knowledge that I had of him and people I work with, then that kind of lowered his guard in terms of talking. Now, conducting interviews, you have to be very careful that you don't do too much of the talking yourself. Right? So you have to ask really specific questions that aren't yes or no answers to get them to talk. And sometimes your subjects start veering off into territory that you're really not interested in. You got to figure out a way diplomatically to bring them back in. No, I really want to talk about this. And so it was a great exercise for me in terms of how to conduct an interview. But certainly I think he became more and more comfortable with being honest with me, including that little whisper out the door, right? You were right about my relationship, or my limited relationship with President Bush. So thank you, Mina.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking Professor Matthews for a very insightful lecture.